Things the world remembers from the 80s. How was the start of the 80s like almost 40 years ago? Time flies, but what remains are all the things in 80s pop culture 80s kids will certainly remember. Let's rewind a few decades back. Those Walkman cassettes. They still sell portable cassette players because vintage will always be in. Let's go back to the 80s when the Walkman was first introduced. Actually, the Walkman officially came out in 1979, but close enough. Throughout the 80s, this little gadget helped spandex-wearing people everywhere exercise to a soundtrack wherever they wanted. With the little cassette players came these little tapes. Unless you had a mixtape, it looked like you were going to listen to the same artist for your whole run. High on high tops. Society has gone through a lot of fashion trends. Within a year, the preferred look can change. To this day, high top sneakers are still really popular. But when we look back a few decades ago, there's no denying that the Reebok high tops reigned supreme. Like we said, people always love vintage stuff, and even if you're not necessarily going for an 80s look, people still love these sneakers. Listening to We Are the World. There was nowhere you could turn without hearing We Are the World playing somewhere. Even if you got a little annoyed with it playing all the time, you couldn't give it too much flack because it was all for a good cause. In 1985, Lionel Richie and Michael Jackson came together to write this unifying song recorded by the United Support of Artists, which includes Richie himself, Stevie Wonder, Michael Jackson, Diana Ross, and Cyndi Lauper, just to name a few. Jim Henson's Fraggle Rock. They might have come out with a Muppet movie in 2011, but a huge staple of the Muppet media has to be Fraggle Rock. Who doesn't love observing the society of small Muppet creatures? The show aired between 1983 to 1987 and originally played on Canadian, UK, and American TV. The society of Fraggle Rock consisted of silly creatures, doozers, gorgs, and of course, Fraggles. In 2015, a remastered episode of the show aired on ABC Family. Hammertime Pants. For a short time during the 2010s, hair and pants were back in fashion, but in much less, inflation? What's the right word for this? Anyways, the inflation was what made it so popular to wear in the 80s. That and the fact that then superstar and then financially rich man MC Hammer donned them all the time and made them notoriously popular. Back then, most people referred to them as hammer pants, though the more correct term would be harem pants. That green bar paper. If you went to school during the 80s, you probably remember these things. That paper with the perforations and green bars on them. Technically, it's called continuous paper or continuous stationery, and were made for dot matrix as well as line printers. So kids nowadays may be used to just plain white paper, but back in the day, your printed text would come out on this. Playing the Oregon Trail. The world's longest running video game is the Oregon Trail, and it's been going for the last 39 years and counting. So if you didn't grow up in the 80s, you still probably remember this game as a child. And if you're young right now, chances are you've at least heard of the newer version. Long ago, before the rise of video games and computer games, kids didn't have all the variety they did now and would play the Oregon Trail at school to teach them about what pioneer life was like. Garbage Pail Kids. Anybody who hated the Garbage Patch Kid craze was probably a big fan of the Garbage Pail Kid craze, or at the very least, appreciated the way it made fun of Cabbage Patch Kids. The Garbage Pail Kids were put on the market in 1985 and were a series of sticker trading cards which were actually made to parody Cabbage Patch Kids. They even went ahead and made a Garbage Pail movie and then an animated series in 1987. Keep warm with Goose. When researching 80s fashion or even just looking at your parents' old photos, you might have seen a photo, or 10, of someone wearing a triple fat Goose jacket. The company still exists, though if you want that strictly retro 80s style, you need to go buy a vintage one. The jackets are stuffed with premium Goose down, which ensured wearers very stable warmth in the winter. What made the triple fat Goose jackets so popular was because they came in those staple loud colors that were really big in fashion back then. Plus, they were durable. People with Betamax. If you're old enough, you might vaguely remember that VHS and Betamax were competing as the ruling movie cassette player. As we can all infer, VHS won out. But in the 80s, lots of people still had a Betamax in their bedroom or living room in hopes that maybe this one would be the one that makes it. At-home hair lightening. While the 80s were when things like punk and goth were getting really big and people were coloring their hair all sorts of colors, the beach look was also quite in. Gone were the days of letting it all go natural, a sentiment that got left in the 70s. To get that sun-kissed look on your hair, teens used a product called Sun-In, a hair lightener you could just spray in your hair at home. You then could go out in the sun and watch as the weeks passed by and your hair got somewhat lighter. The Double Dare. Maybe 90s kids like to brag about all their Nickelodeon memories, but let's not forget about Double Dare, the game show that started in 1986 and would keep going until 1993. There was a brief revival in 2000, and then again this year. Double Dare had two teams pitted against each other, going through a mix of trivia questions and stunts that got a bit messy, all in the name of winning cash and other sweet prizes. Wouldn't you sit in a bowl of spaghetti for that stuff too? Playing with Skipits. Again, you might remember this 90s kids, but Skipits were first released in the 1980s. Thanks in part to networks like Nickelodeon airing Skipits commercials, the toy found a lot of success. Invented by Maggie Harvey, Avi Arad, and Mel Kennedy, the Tiger Electronics manufactured toy consisted of a plastic hoop and a stretchy string that had a ball attached to the end. You placed the hoop around your ankle, and then you had your own little game of helicopter. John Hughes teen movies. No one's adolescence is complete without watching a few of John Hughes' teen movies, or all of them. While he's written and directed a bunch of movies, none are more of a staple in American youth than the ones that came out in the 80s, such as Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Pretty in Pink, Some Kind of Wonderful, and of course, The Breakfast Club. Nothing encapsulated what being a middle-class teen in America was like more than Hughes' work at the time. All That Spandex. Why was spandex so popular in the 80s? With the 80s came an aesthetic of bright colors and weird patterns and big hair, and for some reason, spandex really fit in with that look. Perhaps it was the steady climb of fitness as a mainstream hobby for women and men alike. If you couldn't make it to the gym, no worries. Your VHS probably had a fitness video sitting on top of it that would get rewound the next day. People could just pull on those leotards and spandex and work out as much as they wanted in the comfort of their own home. How can we even judge? Athleisure clothes are still fashionable to this day. Creepy, cool movies. What do you call movies like The Dark Crystal and the most iconic Labyrinth? They're creepy cool, not exactly bright and shiny enough to be considered a totally family-friendly movie, but also a tad too creepy for little kids to watch by themselves. The Dark Crystal came out in 1982, directed by Jim Henson and Frank Oz, showing how far special effects had come in film history. Before heavily used CGI, filmmakers had to rely more on practical effects to make extraordinary things happen on screen. Practical effects like that seen in movies such as Labyrinth took making fantasy movies to a different level. The time of HeMan. A list about 80s culture is not complete without mentioning HeMan. This character first appeared in a comic book series and then would turn the universe into the more popular animated series that aired on television. The idea was apparently born out of the fact that Mattel wanted a new toy line that would compete with the Star Wars toys being launched, especially since they initially declined the deal to make them prior to the success of the first Star Wars movies. So then, the lead designer of the Mattel Preliminary Design Department would help make the idea of HeMan come to life. TV figures in the 80s. With the mid-century came the invention of the TV. Since then, it became more and more common to find this device in living rooms, especially in the United States. The 80s was a huge time for TV, and so TV figures grew to a new kind of popularity. You'd see people like Mr. T on shows like The A-Team. For older audiences, primetime soap opera Dallas was pretty huge. Then, of course, there was The Cosby Show, which really solidified Bill Cosby's career. Anyway, the top shows of the decade included The Love Boat, The Jeffersons, MASH, and Murder, She Wrote. Girls dressed like this. If they weren't wearing neon spandex, then another in-look of the day would be the style you would often see on people like Madonna and Cyndi Lauper. Their hair had to be big and messy. You wore fingerless gloves, tight pants, short skirts, corsets, lace, and fishnets. Today, we might refer to this look as the material girl look. If you were a material girl, you wore every accessory you could, from big earrings, huge bracelets, rings, and hats, all at the same time. The 50s theme. Anytime something is retro, it's cool, but it has to be a certain amount of years that have passed in order for the trend to come back. In the mid-2000s, the 80s was super popular, with it changing later on. Now, the early 2000s fashion is slowly coming back again. It's the way fashion works. For the 80s, the big retro aesthetic was the 50s. Did you ever notice how prominent 50s nostalgia was during this time? You saw it in movies like Grease and Back to the Future. People then had 50s themed parties all the time. Why was this the case? Maybe because the conservativeness of the 50s and the happy bright aesthetic had come back to mainstream 80s culture. We're nearly at number 1, but before we get there, let's ask you this question. If you could travel back to the 80s, what would be one trend you would bring back to modern day? Let us know in the comments below. Music television. Before the teen shows and lack of music videos, MTV actually played music videos and music-related content hosted by video jockeys. The first time this channel hit TV waves was in 1981, with the first music video awards held in 1984. The target demographic included high school and college students, something still true to this day, so there's that. The first words to be spoken on the channel were spoken by John Lack, with the phrase, "Ladies and gentlemen, rock and roll," playing over footage of the first space shuttle launch countdown to the Columbia. You ever wonder why there was that little astronaut on the MTV flag on the moon? That's why. Thank you so much for watching. Hit that thumbs up if you enjoyed today's video. Stick around for more content by clicking subscribe and turning on that bell notification so you don't miss a beat.